My name is Hank, and I've been driving trucks for almost 20 years now. Back then, I was 42, divorced, and just trying to make ends meet while keeping up with child support for my teenage daughter, Emily. I lived in a small town in Missouri, the kind where everybody knows your business, which was why I loved being out on the road. There's something about the solitude of driving, mile after mile of open highway, with nothing but old country music crackling through the speakers, that made it easier to forget the mess I'd made of my personal life. Route 12 was my usual haul. It was a long, lonely stretch of highway that cut through the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields and patches of forest that seemed to go on forever. It was mid-October, the days getting shorter, and I remember the air had that chill that signaled winter was just around the corner. Nights on Route 12 could be eerie, with fog rolling in from the fields, and the feeling that you were the only soul for miles. That kind of loneliness can get to a man. It made me think about Emily, about how long it had been since we'd really talked, how the divorce had made her drift away from me. I'd tried to bridge the gap, but I guess I'd never tried hard enough. It was a Tuesday night, late, and I'd stopped at a truck stop that looked like it had seen better days, maybe back in the 70s. The neon sign out front flickered, barely illuminating the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Inside, the attendant barely looked up from his magazine when I walked in, just gave me a nod. He was an older guy, hunched over, with tired eyes that seemed to have seen it all. I grabbed a cup of coffee, the kind that tasted more like burnt water, and made small talk. He eyed me for a moment, then said, "You're driving Route 12 tonight?" When I nodded, he frowned. "Just don't stay out there too long after dark. Strange things happen on that road." I laughed it off, thinking it was just a local trying to mess with an out-of-towner. But the look in his eyes stuck with me, a sort of quiet seriousness that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I paid for my coffee, wished him a good night, and headed back to my rig. The road was empty, just the hum of the engine and the darkness stretching out ahead of me. I turned the radio on, trying to find something to fill the silence. I found an old country station, the familiar twang of Johnny Cash echoing through the cab. It was comforting in a way, a reminder of simpler times. But then I noticed something. Headlights, far behind me, barely visible through the fog. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably another trucker, I figured. But the lights didn't seem right. They flickered, like they were struggling to stay on, and then they were gone. I checked my mirrors, squinting into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road behind me. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe it was just the fog playing tricks on me. But a few miles later, the lights were back, flickering closer this time, and then gone again. I could feel my pulse quicken, my hands gripping the wheel a little tighter. I pulled over to the side of the road, the engine rumbling as I climbed out to check the rig. Maybe something had come loose. Maybe the scraping noise I thought I'd heard was more than just my imagination. I walked around, my flashlight cutting through the mist, and that's when I saw it. A worn-out leather wallet lying there on the ground just beneath the trailer. I picked it up, the leather cracked and faded, and flipped it open. Inside was an old ID card, yellowed with age. The photo showed a man, probably about my age, with a serious expression. The date on the ID was from the 1960s. A chill settled in my chest, and I dropped the wallet, stepping back, my eyes scanning the darkness. There was no one out there, just the whisper of the wind through the trees and the low rumble of my truck. I climbed back into the cab, slamming the door shut, my heart pounding. I just wanted to get moving, to get off that road and put as many miles between me and whatever was out there as possible. A crackle came over the radio, breaking the silence. "Breaker, breaker, you out on Route 12 tonight?" The voice was scratchy, distant. I grabbed the receiver, my hands still shaking. "Yeah, I'm here. Who's this?" There was a pause. Then the voice came back, quieter this time. "You see them ghost riders yet?" I felt a shiver run through me. Ghost riders? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Saw 'em back in '76, the voice said. Out on Route 12. They don't ever leave, you know. They're stuck, just like the rest of us. Then the radio went dead. I tried to call back, but there was nothing. Just static. I set the receiver down, my hands trembling. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I had to keep moving. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the fog growing thicker, swallowing the beams of my headlights. And then I saw them. Figures standing on the side of the road. Just glimpses at first. A flash of a face, a silhouette in the mist. They were dressed in old clothes, the kind you'd see in black and white photos. Their eyes followed me as I drove past, blank and empty, their faces pale in the glow of my headlights. I kept my eyes forward, my heart pounding, refusing to look back. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I did, I'd see them sitting in the cab with me, their cold eyes staring. I finally reached the drop-off point just before dawn, the sky beginning to lighten in the east. The place was a small depot, barely more than a couple of buildings and a gravel lot. I pulled in, shutting off the engine, and let out a shaky breath. I climbed out of the cab, my legs unsteady, and that's when I saw it. Another truck, just like mine, pulling into the lot. I watched, confused, as the driver stepped out, and my blood ran cold. It was me. Or someone who looked just like me. Same jacket, same hat, same tired eyes. He moved to the back of the truck, starting to unload, not even glancing my way. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and that's when I realized. The figures I'd seen on the side of the road, the ones dressed in old clothes, they were all truckers. Drivers who'd taken this route before, who'd seen the ghosts and never left. I turned, scrambling back into my truck, my hands shaking as I tried to start the engine. It refused to turn over, the key clicking uselessly in the ignition. I could see them now standing at the edge of the lot, watching me. The other me, the ghostly reflection, just kept unloading, like this was all normal. Like I wasn't even there. Panic surged through me and I pounded on the wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sun was rising, the first rays of light cutting through the fog, and for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd be okay. But the figures didn't fade. They just stood there, their eyes empty, their faces expressionless. And that's when I knew. I wasn't leaving Route 12. Not really. I was part of it now, just another ghost on the side of the road, stuck in a loop that would never end. Story 2. My name is Tom, and I've been driving trucks for about a decade now. I'm 29, single, and mostly keep to myself, which suits me just fine on long drives through empty highways. My usual route takes me between Arizona and California, hauling goods under the desert sun. I've never been much for picking up strangers. Too many stories out there about hitchhikers with bad intentions. Besides, I had a close friend, Pete, who went missing a few years back after picking up someone on the road. They found his truck, empty, parked at a rest stop. No sign of Pete. After that, I swore I'd never risk it. But that night, I broke my own rule. It was early August, one of those nights where the air doesn't cool down even after the sun sets. I was somewhere along Route 66, a stretch of desolate road where cell service was patchy at best, and the stars were the only things that kept you company. I had my windows down, letting the dry desert air sweep through the cab, old country songs playing low on the radio. I was tired, too many hours behind the wheel, and just wanted to make it to the next rest stop to get a couple of hours of sleep. That's when I saw her, standing on the shoulder, barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, with long dark hair and a pale dress that looked almost gray in the night. She stood there, one arm out, thumb pointing down the road. For a second, I was tempted to just drive past. I had every reason not to stop. But there was something in the way she looked at me. Her eyes, wide and desperate, that made me tap the brakes. I pulled over, my truck rumbling as it idled. She didn't hesitate. She walked up to the passenger side and I leaned over, popping the door open. "Where are you headed?" I asked. She climbed in without answering right away, just giving me this tired, almost relieved smile. "Home," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to go home." I nodded, not pressing for details. I figured she'd had a rough night, maybe a fight with a boyfriend, maybe her car had broken down somewhere back along the road. I'd take her as far as I could, drop her off at the next safe place. As we started rolling again, I tried to make some small talk, asking where she was from, what she was doing out here. But her answers didn't quite add up. She said she was from a town I'd never heard of, somewhere that didn't seem to exist. The way she spoke, it was like she was lost in her own head, her eyes distant, staring out at the dark desert passing by. After a while, I gave up trying to talk. I focused on the road, but there was this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. The GPS on my dash had started acting up, the map flickering, the little arrow that was supposed to show my location spinning in circles. I tapped the screen, but it didn't help. According to it, we were driving on a road that wasn't even there. I swallowed hard, glancing over at her. She was staring straight ahead, her lips moving like she was whispering something, but there was no sound. My skin crawled. "Hey," I said, my voice coming out more forceful than I intended. "You okay?" She turned to look at me, her eyes wide, but she didn't say anything, just nodded once, slowly. I tried to ignore the chill that had settled in the cab, the way my breath seemed to catch in my throat. I told myself it was just exhaustion, just my mind playing tricks on me after too many miles and not enough sleep. We drove like that for another hour, the silence between us growing heavier with every passing mile. I spotted a sign for a truck stop up ahead. Finally, a place to rest, to get her somewhere safe. I pulled in, the neon lights of the old gas station flickering, casting long shadows across the dusty lot. I turned to tell her we were here, that she could call someone if she needed. But the seat beside me was empty. My heart skipped a beat. The door hadn't opened. I hadn't heard anything. But she was gone. I stared at the seat, at the indentation where she'd been sitting, and felt a cold shiver run through me. I climbed out of the cab, looking around the lot, but there was no sign of her. It was like she'd just vanished into thin air. I walked into the truck stop, my legs feeling unsteady. The attendant behind the counter gave me a nod, barely looking up from his newspaper. I grabbed a cup of coffee, the steam curling up in the cool air, and tried to steady my hands. My eyes drifted to the stack of newspapers on the counter, the headline catching my attention. "Local woman still missing after 10 years. I picked it up, my eyes scanning the article. There was a photo, grainy, black and white, of the woman. The same woman I'd picked up on the side of the road. My stomach turned, the coffee forgotten, slipping from my hands and splattering across the floor. The attendant looked up, startled, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The words in the article swam in front of my eyes. She'd gone missing on this very stretch of road, a decade ago, last seen hitchhiking home. I stumbled back out to my truck, my heart pounding. I needed to leave, to get away from that place. I climbed into the cab, slamming the door shut, my hands trembling as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I pulled out of the lot, my eyes darting to the mirrors, half expecting to see her standing there watching me. The road stretched out ahead, the darkness swallowing the headlights, and that's when I realized I'd seen that sign before. The same gas station, the same flickering lights. I looked at the GPS, the screen still spinning, showing nothing but empty space. I was driving in circles, retracing the same stretch of road over and over again. My chest tightened, a sense of dread settling deep in my bones. I knew then that I was trapped, just like her, stuck on that desolate road, caught in the same loop, reliving her last ride. And no matter how far I drove, no matter how many times I tried to leave, I knew I'd always end up back here on Route 66 with the ghost of a hitchhiker who would never make it home. Story 3. My name is Jake, and I've been driving trucks for almost 15 years now. I'm 36, and lately, the long hours on the road have become my escape from everything else. I live just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Not the city itself, but a quiet place about 40 minutes away, where it's easy to forget that the world is still moving. Until recently, I had someone waiting for me at home. Her name was Rachel. We were together for 5 years, on and off, I guess, until she decided that being on her own was better than waiting for me to come back from my runs. I don't blame her, really. I spent more time in this truck than I did with her. That's probably why, after she left, I found myself taking the night shifts. There's something about driving at night that makes it easier to forget. The roads are empty, just me, the hum of the tires on asphalt, and the occasional flash of headlights from another lonely soul making their way across the highways. I'd turn the radio up, trying to drown out the quiet. But lately, even that hadn't helped. The silence felt heavy, pressing in from all sides. And then, on one particular rainy night, it all got a lot worse. It was late October, around midnight, and I was on one of those empty stretches of highway, halfway between Atlanta and Savannah. It had been raining steadily for hours, the kind of rain that makes the world blurry, the headlights reflecting off the slick road and making it hard to see much of anything. I'd been driving for hours, trying to keep my mind off Rachel, trying not to think about what she might be doing or who she might be with now. I had the radio on, but the storm kept causing interference, static crackling in and out, drowning out the country tunes I was relying on to fill the cab. I was just about to turn it off altogether when I heard it. Not the music, but something else. A voice. At first, I thought it was another station bleeding over. That happens sometimes. But as I listened closer, I realized it was Rachel's voice. Soft, barely audible beneath the static, but unmistakably hers. She was saying something I'd heard her say 100 times before during one of our arguments. "You never listen, Jake. You're always somewhere else." My hands tightened on the wheel, my pulse quickening. It didn't make sense. It had to be my imagination, or maybe I was just so damn tired that I was hearing what I wanted to hear. I shook my head, trying to clear it, but the voice kept coming through, distorted and faint, like she was right there, just out of reach. I told myself it was just the storm, the static playing tricks on me. I kept driving, my eyes fixed on the road, the wipers swishing back and forth, trying to push away the rain that wouldn't let up. I stopped for gas at a small station just off the highway. The kind of place with one attendant, barely awake behind the counter, and a single pump that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. I got out, the rain soaking through my jacket almost immediately, and started filling up the tank. And then I heard it again. Her voice, only this time it wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the PA system, echoing across the empty lot. "Jake, why do you always run away?" I froze, the gas pump slipping from my hand and clattering to the ground. I looked around, my heart pounding, but there was no one. Just the attendant, who hadn't moved, still staring blankly at his phone behind the counter. I picked up the pump, my hands trembling as I finished fueling up. I wanted to ask the guy inside if he'd heard anything, but what was I going to say? That I was hearing my ex-girlfriend's voice in the middle of nowhere? He'd think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy. I paid for the gas and got back in the truck, slamming the door shut, trying to shake off the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Back on the road, the rain finally started to let up, but the unease didn't. I checked my phone, hoping maybe Rachel had called. Maybe there was some explanation for all of this. But the screen was acting strange. Flickering, showing old text messages from her that I knew I'd never seen before. Messages like, "Please, Jake, just come home," and "I need you to listen." My stomach twisted, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air seeping in through the window. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I needed to get off that road, to find somewhere to pull over and catch my breath. I kept my eyes on the road, the rain now just a drizzle, the mist rising off the asphalt in ghostly wisps. That's when I heard it. A whisper, right in my ear, as if someone were sitting beside me, leaning in close. "Jake." I jerked the wheel, the truck swerving slightly before I managed to straighten it out. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short gasps. I glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting to see her there, but it was empty. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I needed to stop, to get out of that truck, to clear my head. I pulled over to the side of the road, the tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. I sat there for a moment, the engine idling, trying to catch my breath. The rain had stopped completely now, and the night was eerily quiet. I leaned back, closing my eyes, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. The static, the voice, the messages. Just my mind playing tricks on me. Just the loneliness getting to me after all these months. And then I saw her, standing in the middle of the road, her hair wet, her dress clinging to her, the same way it used to after we'd get caught in the rain together. She was looking at me, her eyes sad, her lips moving, though I couldn't hear what she was saying. I blinked, and she was gone. Just like that. The road was empty, the mist swirling where she'd been standing. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. I just sat there, staring at the spot where she'd been, my mind racing. Eventually, I managed to put the truck back in gear, to start moving again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there. Somewhere. Just out of sight. It wasn't until the next day that I found out. Rachel had died in a car accident that night. Her car had gone off the road, not far from where I'd seen her. Now every time I'm out on that stretch of highway, I hear her. In the static on the radio, in the whispers that come from the darkness, in the rain that taps against the windows. She's still out there somewhere trying to reach me. And I know deep down that she'll never stop. Not until I listen.